Hi, thank you for coming to another spotlight of UnifyChai. Today we have Heeta, who is the founder of the ClimAct Initiative and Youth Negotiators. And today we're just going to be learning a little bit more about her journey and what inspired her to create these organizations. So the first question we have for you is, could you explain a little bit more on what these two organizations are, the ClimAct Initiative and Youth Negotiators, and just some major contributions that you've created through them?
Yeah, thank you. So starting first with the Youth Negotiators Academy, this is a global organization. We focus on training young people to be diplomats at the UN Intergovernmental Environmental Negotiations. So at the climate and this year onwards, also on land and desertification. So it sounds complicated, but what we basically do is we work with countries from around the world. We sign agreements with them, which basically states that the country will nominate young people to us, who we train to be representatives of their national governments. We started 2.5 years ago. So we started at the UN Climate Change Convention. So the climate change COPs that you see that happen year on year. So we've had 50 countries, 50 young people from 26 countries that we trained in the first year, and in 2022 for COP27. And then the next year we had from 54 different countries, we trained over 170 young people. Out of them, 120 plus were at the COP in Dubai at COP28. And this year we're working with over 60 countries and a lot larger cohort. So that's on the climate side. And then starting this year, we've also launched a second program under the UNCCD, which is the Convention to Combat Desertification. So it focuses on land and desertification related issues. So that's our first year there. So working also on a much smaller scale, but working with countries, with over 30 countries in that side as well. So that's on the Youth Negotiators Academy. And then moving to the ClimAct Initiative, which is focused in India. And this is what I'm now doing full time. I have recently just stepped down of day-to-day operations at the Youth Negotiators Academy. We have a new team and a much larger team to sort of build up the work that we've been doing there. So now I've been focusing all of my time on building the ClimAct Initiative, which is focused on climate education, leadership building, capacity building, mainly for young people, but not only for young people in India. So this started mainly as a passion project, and but now it is a registered organization. We have 3 different programs that we run, and the newest program is the Climate Leadership Program. And this is basically working with young people between the ages of 18 to 25 to build climate education and leadership skills for them to be able to go ahead and take action projects. So it's a 6-month program focusing on 4 months of training and 2 months of action.
Yeah. Thank you. And we could see that like a lot of your programs focus on climate change and like combating climate change. We're wondering like what inspired you to focus on climate change and like what just encouraged you to create these organizations and like the story behind like how you went towards like founding them.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think ever since I was young, I wanted to do something in environment. I didn't know what and why and how. So I remember a moment when I was about 13, I was coming home from school and I live in Mumbai, and the route was by the sea, by Marine Drive. And they were doing this beautification project. So basically, on the side of the sea, it was lined by coconut palm trees interspersed with some other trees. So in this beautification project, they were widening the promenade, making it into a better walkway. And in order to do that, they had to take down the coconut trees that were lining the side of the road. So they said that they would be transplanting them, etc. And I was too young to ask questions or to understand or to even know what has happened to them. But that was one such afternoon when the work was underway, and there was this huge coconut tree they'd probably just uprooted, and it was lying horizontal on this massive trailer. And it was quite a sight. Like until today, I have the sight very vividly in my head the moment I think about it, because you could see its entire root system, its leaves, like the majestic long big tree, but instead of standing upright, it was horizontal. And they probably did transplant it. It probably did survive. I'm not sure what happened to it. I have no idea. But that itself completely shook me, and I was in tears by the time I got home. And I didn't know what to do. So that sort of left an impression. And I think it was around that time when someone jokingly was just like, if you care so much, you should just be an environmentalist. So I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up. So that's how it basically started for me without really understanding what it truly meant. And then, of course, I went ahead, I did a master's in environmental studies, and it went from there. Um, but then professionally, I think the journey also took some few turns eventually. I studied German. I worked as a German language translator actually after I finished my master's for a year. So I didn't do anything related to the environment right after I'd graduated. But this was around the time in 2015 when COP21 was about to take place. And it was in the media, and it was a lot of like, world leaders are going to be here, and with big, hopes and expectations and things like this. Um, so this was when I was starting to ask around. I was just like, I wanted to do something in environment, and this looks like the place to be. So I wrote to a bunch of people, and I was like, how do I get to this conference? And I tried registering online. And now, of course, I laugh at myself and I look at the journey, but that's basically what a lot of people begin with. Um, so that's how someone gave me accreditation, or basically registration for a week of the COP. And that's how I took a week off work and I went for the COP and the conference of youth that happened just before that. And that was the sort of foot in the door. I mean, I didn't know anything. I was completely confused. I have no idea how the negotiations function. I didn't know how to, what to do with me being there. How do you engage? How do you talk to people? It was very overwhelming. It was extremely intimidating. Uh, so in terms of my work at COP, it probably was not much. But the good thing it did was it made me want to get back and to get basically in the environment space. So I came back, and a few months later quit my job and started volunteering. So was that was the starting point. And then I started engaging with the youth constituency with the UN climate change, which is called Yango. Joined their sort of working groups, and then eventually sort of joined their admin team at that point. And then a few years later, in 2019, I joined. I ran for elections and basically was elected at the COP25 in Madrid. I was elected as the global focal point for Yango. So that basically meant that there are two people who are elected as the liaisons, so sort of to lead this youth constituency, and I was one of the two, one from the global north and one from the global south. So that was the trajectory internationally. And through basically the work that we'd done, I mean, the work that we worked with young people from across the world, especially since 2016 or 17, since I started getting more and more engaged. I met young people from so many different parts of the world, so many different cultures, doing so many different things. So it was a very steep learning curve, one, in terms of how do you work with people from across the world, but two, in also just understanding the UN process, understanding how do you engage in that. A lot of the nuances, the technicalities, understanding the documents, I had to figure it out by myself over the few years. So when we finished our mandate as global focal point for COP26 in 2021, my co-focal point and I, we also became really good friends through the process. And then we thought for years, people have been saying we need young people at decision-making tables. And we did a lot of work at COP26 and in the lead up to COP26 to build that up. But there's still a gap. And at the end of the day, the decision makers are people who are part of national delegations. You can be there, you can lobby, you can talk to them, but that's the maximum that you can do. You're not in the rooms making those decisions. So that was where the idea for the Youth Negotiators Academy came up. And that's how we then met two of our other co-founders along the way. And that's how that was started. And the other side is also a similar timeline, but a different sort of reasoning. And I mentioned, so the more I started working with young people from across the world, the more it made me realize how much we don't have access to information back home in India. I had a master's degree in the field from one of the best universities in the country. I had engaged internationally, and still a lot of the process I had to learn by myself. So a lot of this is really not somewhere that you can, and it is a privilege to be able to go to these spaces year after year and engage year after year by yourself. So not a lot of young people actually have that. And this is where I then sort of got into climate education back at home. It started as a passion project for me just out of curiosity. I wanted to try and bridge the gap between what happens internationally to what we can do. And the more I started doing that, the more I realized that we actually need to really talk about what climate change is and what does it mean and how does it affect us. So it moved more on climate education from there. So that's how it took a sort of turn. And then in around the same time, and by end of 2021, early 2022 was when I felt the need of setting it up as an organization and then founded the ClimAct Initiative.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your story, especially like from getting your foot in the door to now like where you've become and what you founded. We really love like sharing these stories and kind of just like your journeys and your perspective. And kind of on that note, is like with climate change initiatives and just like youth having their voices heard, how have you seen South Asian youth play a bigger role within climate change? And why do you think youth voices are particularly important, especially in spaces like this?
Yeah, I mean, why do I think young people or youth voices are important? It's very simple. One, it's our future that we're talking about. And I'm part of I'm out of the youth age group very soon, but this is it's a future a legacy that we're leaving for generations to come. And if you're going to be facing the consequences, you need to be part of the decision making, or at least understanding the decision making. Even if you're not part of it, you need to understand what and how these decisions are made. So that is the biggest one. It's very simple. And the other bit is also, I think for South Asia, it's also very, very special. With such a large population of young people, we talk about so many different, experiences, so many different, within the region itself, so many different, languages, cultures, foods, lifestyles, histories. And a lot of this day by day, changing because of the climate and not very consciously changing. Of course, this climate is not the only reason. There's a lot of other reasons in addition to this, but climate is a big motivating factor or a big push behind why certain, decisions or certain things happen. And I think the biggest point for me was that, especially when I talk about young people in India, and now India is is the youngest country and the most populous country in the world. We have a massive population of young people who are going to be facing the impacts of climate change. We have so many different young people who also do not understand what this means, who do not know what or how they can even be prepared to face the future. Or, even just as simple as work and jobs or like careers. Careers are going to look very different in a very short period of time. And there is no conversation, there is no sort of this is happening in pockets, and yes, it's happening more and more over the last few years, but it is still in pockets and it is not mainstream. So we really need more like mainstream conversations, mainstream actions, where people can actually realize that this is something that is affecting them and can make conscious choices on how they want to then live their lives. So that was one of the biggest push for me. And that still continues to be one of the biggest push. I think over the years, when I started initially in 2017, the number of young people that knew about climate change, that knew about the international climate conferences, the UN, was very, very small. And that number is very large already, with access to social media, with more young people getting involved. So that is already a good thing. But despite all of that, there is still a massive gap on just what is still needed to be done.
Thank you for that response. And you mentioned how like many youths don't know where to get started or like how to advocate. A big aspect of our platform is encouraging other people to advocate and make change. So we're wondering like what advice you have or like any ways that you think that individuals can advocate like against climate change around their communities.
Yeah. I think one is just to understand what is happening, right? And to understand it in a very local context so that you can then talk to people in a manner that, makes sense to them. And this is, I think, one of the biggest needs is really to be able to not just talk about climate change, that is something happening in, glaciers are melting or, the polar bears are dying, but something that actually makes sense to them. And what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? Because that helps in changing narratives, that helps in changing conversations, that helps in, even if it's starting with individual action, like those are things that you can then see and do, and they're slightly more tangible. So that is, I think, the first step for me. And then the other bit is also just trying to, it's having a mix of between understanding, yes, the local issues, but then also the big picture, and trying not to get caught up in one or the other. because we do need to have a mix of both. We need to see how both affect each other, but they're also very complementary to each other. So really trying to see that we're not, while we hear more doom and gloom news, every few days here and there in some parts of the world, I think the idea is also to really try and look at the smaller wins to see how can we make change. How do we then celebrate the small wins to keep us going? Because at the end of the day, we all need some amount of motivation and hope to keep going. So really trying and understanding, creating a community, trying to, have people who can then be that sort of space for you is one of the other sort of things. And this can happen the more you work, the more you talk to people, the more you then understand what are the changes going on. And then, of course, then understanding the big picture and going back and forth and trying to find the right mix between the two.
Perfect. We really love hearing your input on that situation and like kind of going on with more community and having voices represented, especially on scales like this. Why do you think like especially like South Asian voices are now so important to hear, and how can more South Asian voices be represented at platforms such as the UN and bigger platforms?
Yeah. I think one of the most important reasons is very similar to what I mentioned earlier. I mean, it's on the same lines of that we're drastically seeing the impacts of climate change in South Asia, whether it is just extreme heat waves in the summer, whether it is the monsoon, which is going absolutely haywire, the floods everywhere. So we're really seeing the impacts on a day-to-day basis. This is not something that we see once in a while anymore. We're seeing it on a seasonal basis. We're seeing it every few months, every few weeks. So yeah, I mean, this is a reality that we're already living with, and I think this is strong enough to say that we're the ones facing the impacts of climate change. We need to be part of also creating solutions for the same, and creating solutions that work for us and not just work for some other parts of the world. But at the same time, I think like we have so much innovation in South Asia, and I think young people are also very. I mean, we come with a lot of energy, but there's also a lot of zeal to make change. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of questioning. There's a lot of not just taking things for the way they are. So that is quite interesting, and I think that is really helpful to make sure that there is, of course, exchange of knowledge, but there's also cooperation, whether it is exchange of expertise, whether it's you're learning from somebody, but you're also experiencing certain things. So you're living, you have the realities, you have the expertise for certain things as well. And in terms of representation internationally, this is always a challenge. We're never going to have all the people from across the world to be able to represent at the COP. But what we do need is to find the right people who can, or the people that are there basically, who can be the sort of medium and the sort of voices for the larger populations that they do represent. So I think one is just that if you do have the chance to attend, whether it is a national or an international or any other space like this, whether it is a decision making, whether it is a conference, whether it is anything else, I think the first thing to realize is that who are you really representing beyond just yourself? And can you go back, can you understand, can you sort of talk to, get diverse perspectives with you when you go to certain spaces, so that when you speak, for example, to people, you're not just coming out of your own mindset. You're coming with slightly bigger collective than just you. And that is the first step. And the other is, of course, then how do we pass on opportunities? And a lot of this is, when we're seeing this more and more, not just in climate, but in a lot of different spaces, because a lot of these opportunities are not necessarily financial. So the only thing that you get is probably representation or, some media, support or, things like this here and there. So a lot of this is basically, then you will end up seeing very similar, people or voices in the same spaces after a few years over and over again. So how do we really truly pass on the mic to other people in the community? So how do we create, like, if we've gotten an opportunity, how do we then open doors for other people to come in once, you've understood what can be done, and we move on? So that is, I think, another big thing that we really have to all learn to build.
And just moving on with like talking more about the UN, you mentioned how like there's different perspectives in the UN now, and there's like an increase in diversity. So we were wondering, like, how do you think bigger platforms such as the UN have increased their diverse perspectives? And like, have you seen that make a positive impact when it comes to climate change?
Yeah. So in terms of increasing diversity, I think there has been a lot of push from the outside as well. It's not just internally, but also a lot of ask and demands and, just people knowing about the UN and the conferences and the decision making and the negotiations, that the doors have had to open. So that is that is one way for it to work. So if it doesn't work inside out, it works outside in. But I think the other bit is also just that to truly understand how that this can like how do you actually make sure that this is being represented in the right way. And I think this is the same thing, like when you get to a conference, like one is of course to try and understand who you could ideally be a part of, but two is to also understand what your role is over there. So really going in, doing a little bit of prep work, doing a little bit of training. Like I said, when I went in, I had no idea. And a lot of my work that I do now is basically helping build capacity of young people who go to such conferences, to be able to then engage meaningfully, to be able to make sure that their time there is fruitful and they don't have to spend the next few months and years just having to figure out how this works. So this is, I think, key is really trying to find the right spaces, trying to find the right groups, doing a mix of, one, it also creates a sense of community. A lot of these UN conferences are extremely massive. They're big, they're overwhelming, and they're exhausting. So knowing someone is already a big win in this massive whale and this, trying to navigate this sort of ocean of especially the UN climate conference, but even some of the other ones. So one, it helps in sense of community, but two, it also helps you feel slightly more prepared. You can go there and not to say hit the ground running, but at least you're not going to feel like you're drowning underwater. So you can try and engage, you can understand what's going on, and you can then meaningfully be a part of the process. So you flying all the way, no matter from what part of the world, to such a conference like this, spending all, whether it is funding support that you receive externally or your own finance or whatever that mix might be, how do you make best use of it? And this is really what you do there with your time. And if you have some amount of training and preparation, it really helps to be a lot more productive then.
Thank you so much for the response. Those are all the questions that we have. The last thing we did want to ask is a big aspect of our platform. It's UnifyChai, so the chai aspect. And we like to ask everyone that we interview for their favorite recipe or like snack that they like to eat with chai. And it like really symbolizes how like despite our diverse perspectives and backgrounds, like the one thing we have in common is our love for chai. So we were wondering like if you have a favorite snack that you like to eat with chai and like if you have any significance behind it.
Thank you for that question. I'm still finishing my cup of chai for today. No, I think this is very timely. It's a mix, I think. If I have to talk about my favorite snack, that's quite complicated. Well, my favorite snack would be. Oh, this is a hard question. Well, I think one answer would be in Gujarati, we call it a chakri, or in South India, it's called a murukku or a chakli or different things. But basically, I think that would be my favorite snack. I think I can eat that any day, anytime. But at home, it generally differs. Yeah, I'm currently in Canada, so I'm snacking with whatever I get around here. But at home, it differs. I think a lot of it would probably be homemade. Snacks, but I think chakri is probably my most favorite with chai.
All right, thank you so much for sharing. That means a lot. And just thank you so much for taking out your time to do this. We really love learning about your journey and like we could really see your passion for climate change. And we really hope that like your platform grows and with that more people get educated on this topic as well. So just thank you so much for taking out your time for this and we really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.